Okay, let's start. We'll just restart Plato, skipping over what we dove into last time. Maybe before we jump into Plato, remind ourselves about Socrates first, because Plato can be kind of viewed as just an extension of Socrates. So what do we remember from Socrates?
He first started asking important questions like evaluating definitions.
Yeah, so he brought definitions to the forefront. So remember that in his day, the society around him was kind of evolving into this skepticism. And so he was kind of addressing, why is this happening? And he thought one of the reasons that this is happening, one of the reasons people think that there is no right or wrong answer about what's just, for example, is because no one has a definition for justice. And if they first find this definition for justice, then it would eliminate the skepticism that people are devolving into. If they all agreed about the term they were talking about, if they knew what they were talking about, then we could continue from there. So he very much ties knowledge is based in understanding of universals. So he brought definitions to the front. He started opposing the skeptics. He believed in objective and absolute good, truth, and beauty. The good, the true, and the beautiful is what he was in pursuit of. What else do you remember?
He had something with some oracle that said he was the wisest man, so he spent his whole life trying to find someone wiser.
Spent his life in pursuit of a wise man, some person who seemed to have an understanding of these definitions, and every time he examined them, he'd realize, well, this was your definition, but you also said this other thing which contradicts your definition, so that can't really be your definition. So what's your definition? And those dialogues that Plato has capturing him going through this process, this Socratic method, often end without anything being concluded other than your first automatic attempt at a definition doesn't work. So what's nice about reading those dialogues is because when you first hear one of these definitions, a lot of times you might think, oh yeah, that's pretty good, and Socrates will show you, no, that's bad, think better about it. So getting people thinking deeper about these definitions, even though he doesn't really offer up definitions. It's not until we get to more Platonic writings that definitions are being offered up. Now remember, the dialogue is always Socrates as a mouthpiece, so in later dialogue, Socrates does give definitions, but historians view that as Plato now talking through Socrates rather than capturing what Socrates was trying to say. So, anything else we can think about from Socrates?
Well, it was because of that people started not liking him, and which eventually led to his death, right?
Yeah, eventually led to his death. So his death is pretty interesting because he almost dies twice prior to this. At first, the Democrats come after him because he doesn't do what they want, and he's at risk of losing his life, but ends up surviving. Then the tyranny of the 30 comes to power, and they threaten his life, and he almost dies because he won't do what they want. And then the Democrats come back to power, and he just barely showed his friendship to them by opposing the tyranny of the 30. Because you have the tyranny of the 30 versus the Democrats. He was thoroughly their enemy. So he is opposed to them in defense of the democracy. And the democracy, when they come back to power within a few years, they end up killing him.
That is an interesting thing about the Greeks. We've watched them shoot themselves in the foot, so to speak, numerous times up to this period.
Yeah, so you particularly see that with Athens. It seems like they just constantly are in a sort of downward spiral, hurting themselves more and more. And that's because we're focusing on Athens.
Do you think it's a lack of unity on their part? I mean, it's a really interesting phenomenon, I think, with them.
It's a common scenario that you see with a lot of civilizations in history, that they'll adhere to some rigorous values and they'll apply them in their society, which will cause them to start rising. And as they rise and gain economic success, then they have this evolving into sort of skepticism, and their society collapses with it. So you can see these cycles often with different civilizations. What's his name? What's Dad's favorite historian? Wrote the Story of Civilization. Can't remember his name. Anyways, he captures this exact cycle. So he finds a good period in the history of India where there's no technical evolution really happening, there's no major political changes happening, and so you can, to the best of your ability, identify just this happening in their society. They have their traditional values, which leads them to success, and they decay to skepticism, leading to economic recline and back and forth. So he finds Wilderand, that's his name. So he finds a period in Indian history, Indian as in from India, not natives, where he traces out 4 of these cycles, and to the best of your ability as a historian, found it where no other factors are coming into play. You can't say, oh, the reason that they boomed is because of some other thing, like some technological innovation, or maybe they suddenly came to power where they had colonies bringing in resources, nothing like that. So as well as you can identify the trend, he found a good place that identifies that exact trend. And so yeah, we're watching Athens go through this exact cycle. Common one.
Reminds me of the phrase, pride comes before the fall.
Pride comes before the fall. Yep.
And you're talking about Socrates' death. Didn't he, in effect, choose to die when he did? Because he could have argued himself out, but didn't they give him the opportunity to do that, and he chose to just...
He made it pretty clear to them that he wasn't going to give an inch.
Yeah.
So he's going to live the way that he's going to live, and he's not going to change that. And if they're going to kill him because of it, so be it.
Yeah.
Because he very much viewed that the way he was living his life, he was told by God to live. And so he's going to stick with it. And he points out to Athenians how they'd be a bunch of hypocrites if they want him to do otherwise. Because when he served in the military, there were times where he thought he was facing his death, and yet he still stood his ground out of loyalty to the state. Now, when he thinks he's being loyal to God, they expect him to give an inch? No. So he's saying, you don't even want me to be that kind of man. That's how I'm a good citizen for you.
Right.
So it's a favor to you that I refuse to change.
Which makes him iconic in the sense that he represented principles or values consistently through his life. So in the face of the Greeks that were doing this, they were vacillating up and down with their successes and failures and all of their politics and all that. He was a consistent person, it seemed, in his life. In fact, I remember, I think it was Jordan Peterson was talking about him and his death, and he noted that he came to a point through his trial where he just told them, I have lived a fabulous life. I'm very pleased with what I've learned, with what I've accomplished, and now I'm going to accept death on my terms. I mean, I get to leave on good terms, basically. I'm paraphrasing it. The way Peterson put it was way more eloquent, but in effect, that's what he did, according to Peterson.
Yeah, he definitely does it on his own terms. Even after he's sentenced to death, the dialogue called the Crito is when a bunch of his wealthy friends fought off the prison guards, went there to break him out of prison. And they're like, we have another place set for you to come live. It's going to be great. It's not going to be bad at all, like you were saying in your trial. Let's go. And he refuses to leave. He says, no, that would be breaking the laws. I've subjected myself to these laws. I'm not justified in that. So, yep, he very much was strong convictions in objective and absolute good, truth, beauty, thought that those ought to be adhered to. And so you can see how a character like that kicks off someone like Plato, and how then once we get Plato, how that kicks off someone like Aristotle. So you have Socrates just stands out already, and then you have an even greater, someone who pushes it even further in Plato, and someone who pushes it even further in Aristotle. So you get this amazing trio of intellectual thought that we'll see burst forth, and then we're going to see it just decay right afterwards, which is unfortunate. Okay, so anything else about Socrates before we jump into Plato that you think we should recover? Anything you can remember? I'm asking you as much as anything. Should we talk about this picture? Or maybe we'll talk about that when we start Aristotle, since it's a contrast of them.
We already talked about it last week.
We did? We talked about why he's holding the Timaeus and he's holding the Ethics, and why his hand's like this and his hand's okay.
You talked of the other picture where they show Plato short and small, kind of weird looking, and how you're saying people just threw people, or artists threw people up and painted them.
Oh, Plato. Oh, so I might have made a note that this picture is no way historical, meaning this is not what Plato looked like, and this is not what Aristotle looked like. Plato, as far as we can tell, was a very well-built man, tall, good build, tall, strong, man, that's actually where he gets his name Plato. Plato wasn't his real name. His real name was Aristocles. Plato means broad. It's a nickname his wrestling master gave him because he had such broad shoulders. So he was a big, tall man,
Yeah.
very strong. Whereas Aristotle is supposed to be a shorter, bulkier build type guy. So supposedly, I don't know how they piece these things together. So it goes. So yeah, we'll dive into the details because there's a lot of their philosophical views being caught right there in them opposing each other. In the School of Athens is the name of that painting, and there's very much reason why they're at the center and they're holding the positions that they do, holding the poses. So diving back into Plato, we'll dive back and we'll just skip over the 7 letters that we did last time, but we'll re-talk about some of this stuff to re-get our footing. So obviously, Plato's the greatest pupil of Socrates, and then he's the master of Aristotle. So Aristotle's going to be the third one in this big trio of people that we're talking about. And we come across an interesting problem now as we're getting into Plato. We kind of hit it with Socrates, but we hit it full throttle with Plato, and we'll hit it even worse with Aristotle. And that is now we just have a ton of material on them. So when we were talking about someone like Parmenides, it was real easy for me to go in a week and read everything that there was on Parmenides and then present that to you. There is no chance of me doing that with this much material out there on Plato. So now my ability to pick and choose what I present to you guys and try and like break it down, that's a much harder thing for me to do. I have no clue how to do this with Aristotle, don't have a clue. But the point is now I can only give you a very brief little window into some of their arguments, some of the positions out there on them. And I can only do the best I can, but keep in mind that now you're probably getting a very strong Donnie tint on all their philosophy because I can't give you a good chunk of it. It's just too much to consume.
Well, isn't that what you kind of covered when discovering philosophy, was Plato's works and Aristotle's works?
Plato's works were the first, his dialogues were the first major philosophical text I finished. It's not the first thing I came across. The first thing I tried to go read was the Summa Theologica by Thomas Aquinas, and he kept referencing Aristotle. So then I go and started, I don't even know what from Aristotle, something from Aristotle, and he was referencing Plato, so I figured I should probably go start with Plato. But that was clear back when
What is the timeline
my
from
junior year.
Socrates to Aristotle? Or no, Plato?
Socrates to Plato?
Yeah,
I think Plato is 28 when Socrates dies.
and how old was Socrates when he died?
Socrates died at 71.
71. And then Aristotle was how old compared to Plato?
So let's see. Plato is 427 is when he's born.
Just trying to get a timeline on.
Yeah. And 384. So 16 and 27, 41. Did I do that right? 41 years? No, 43. Not really. There's a lot more that needs to be added.
So Aristotle didn't actually know Socrates at all.
Aristotle never met Socrates, just knew of him.
Through Plato.
Probably through a lot of people, because Socrates was a minor celebrity. So, because almost instantly after his death, the sentiment in Athens is we shouldn't have done that. That was wrong. Kind of like they did when they killed the generals.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
shot themselves in the foot.
Yes, they very much did. So, it quickly the narrative that Athens killed a wise man became a regular narrative, and so he was well known from this point forward. Anyways, so Plato, we have tons about him. 35 dialogues, 13 letters. He's of the early philosophers. These 35 dialogues, these are published works. These are works that he intended for the general public. With Aristotle, we won't get any of that, but so we get a ton of works from Plato that he actually intended people, as a general rule, to read. That's very uncommon. One of the reasons that he's so well preserved is because of the massive influence he had. So Plato is influential from the time he comes onto the scene for like the next 1,600 years. So he's very influential for a very long time, and so his works are pretty well preserved. As opposed to a lot of the other people that we've talked about. He founded the academy, and his followers called themselves academics. That's where we get those words. That's what the school's named after, the academy. Possibly the most influential philosopher of all time. The author talking about his dialogues as ignorance of them. Plato's dialogues is tantamount to ignorance of philosophy itself. He pretty much brought up every major question that philosophy still deals with today. So he pretty much brought up every major philosophical question that there is and gave decent arguments in support of his views. So not only did he raise a question, but he argued specific views on those questions. So the first complete philosopher, you might say. First, to create a complete system of philosophy. So he gives his arguments on metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. If you look at metaphysics, epistemology, and then these three all branch together, then those are considered the three major branches of philosophy. So he has a complete system of philosophy talking on all of the major topics.
So if you were to take a course on ethics today, would it include politics and aesthetics?
No. What's it called for the branch that they have these three together under? They just now have a branch that all three of these come under.
Oh, okay.
But in Plato's day, they were recognized as separate words. So Aristotle, for example, has his book on metaphysics, he has his book on ethics, he has his book on politics, etc. So they're viewed as separate fields, but when we talk about the three major branches of philosophy, we have the branch dealing with the study of reality, metaphysics, the study of how we come to know reality, epistemology, and then the study of value judgments, which you're dealing with value judgments in all three of those. So.
Was this kind of the birthplace of debate? Like current modern debate? This same time period?
To the extent that you include rhetoric in debate, then your first great rhetorician is Empedocles, who we already covered.
Right.
So Aristotle calls him the father of rhetoric. When it comes to these reasoned arguments coming to a conclusion with no poetical language in it, it's just a reasoned argument coming to a conclusion, that's what they call the dialectic. And they credit Zeno with being the father of dialectic, with his paradoxes. So they don't quite give it to Parmenides, because remember, he was still using that very poetical language, whereas now Zeno's just trying to give us actual arguments. So first create a complete system of philosophy. Now, while he created a complete system of philosophy, he was also always conscious of how his overall view was susceptible to challenges. He was very critical of his own philosophy and kept picking away at it, taking issue with it. A famous dialogue, which we all very briefly covered in this class, called the Parmenides, is one of those dialogues where it's Socrates, a young Socrates, having a conversation with Parmenides, and Socrates is trying to present a Platonic view, and Parmenides is just kind of ripping it apart. So it's Plato being very critical of his own ideas, his own opinions, realizing that he doesn't have it all quite worked out, but he thinks he's got the pieces there and still needs to work at it. We already talked about that. Now, Plato, born into very high families, very aristocratic families. He belonged to an aristocratic family. He's related to the original kings of Athens on his father's side, related to Solon, the great lawgiver, one of the 7 sages of the ancient Greek world, on his mother's side. So he's born in the upper echelons of Athenian society. And so he always had, we already talked about this last week, but he always had those opportunities early on to get involved in politics and kept being turned off by his friends and family and how they behaved in politics, people that were already in powerful positions in politics. So he kept being tempted to get in there because he's a young youth and he wants to go out and change the world, make it a better place. But then he sees his friends and family and he watches how they just keep messing things up and destroying things. And so we already talked about twice in these 7th letters how 2 times he was very tempted and then was just disgusted, and particularly with how they treated Socrates. Because remember, he's an avid admirer of Socrates. And I think it's in this letter, the 7th letter, he makes a note that there will never be a dialogue with the name Plato. And that he was just out there with these dialogues to immortalize his master, Socrates. So, a lot of respect for Socrates and the way that Socrates was treated by Athens. Obviously, he was repulsed by, and then we'll briefly cover the other run-in with politics that he had, which also turned him off from trying to achieve a political position. So after Socrates died, Plato goes around traveling the world, basically learning what he can from all these different places. By the time he reaches the age of 40, so he travels for roughly 12 years. Remember, Socrates dies when Plato's 28. So then he leaves Athens after they kill Socrates, and he goes traveling around Greece, supposedly down into Egypt, maybe even some of Asia Minor. But wherever he traveled, we're not sure. There's a lot of speculation there. We know that for sure. By the time he's at age 40, he's over in Sicily. Remember, that's the island at the end of the Italian peninsula where Syracuse is. So he ends up there supposedly to study with the Pythagoreans. And while he's there, he happens to befriend a man by the name of Dion, who's the brother-in-law of the tyrant of Syracuse, Dionysus. So Dionysus is the tyrant of Syracuse. He has complete political control of the city Syracuse, the most powerful city in Sicily, through this connection, Dion. And so they became good friends, started exchanging back and forth. Dion was very enthusiastic about Plato's ideas about politics. He wanted to know more and more, so Plato kept kind of like giving him advice all the time in letters over and over again. So they kept connected. And then it's after this that Plato finally travels back to Athens and founds the academy. So he founds that at the age of 40. Well, upon the death of Dionysus, the tyrant, his son ends up coming to power. So upon the death of Dionysus, Plato was invited by Dion to teach Dionysus II, the next tyrant of Syracuse.
So he's basically back into politics.
Yeah, so he's being sucked back into politics again. Through his friendship with Dion, because Dion's just connected to the family ruling Syracuse. So Dion is asking Plato, hey, won't you come and teach Dionysus II some of your political ideas so that he can rule the city better? Which Plato agrees to do, thinks that's a nice thing to do, to go and advise him. Well, they assume that Dion was somehow trying to drive Dionysus out and become his own tyrant. So Dion was driven out of Syracuse, and Plato was held as a prisoner of Dionysus II for a short period, with his life under threat, before he was finally allowed to return to Athens. So he went there to try and be an advisor. They assumed he was there in some capacity to overthrow the tyrant, so he ends up getting in trouble. So that wasn't great. Then later in his life, Dionysus II actually ended up taking a real liking to Plato, so he invites him back to Syracuse to advise him. Plato once again goes there, fails to accomplish anything, and something similar happens, and he barely makes it out of there with his life again. So, the two times he has high hopes for politics in Athens, they go after Socrates, one of the times killing him, and then 2 times he gets mixed up in politics in Syracuse. It almost cost him his life both times. So, a lot of problems. Anytime he comes in, he has a run-in with politics. And so he's the first philosopher that we're going to talk about that gives a major look on philosophical, or on political philosophy. We've seen ethics already, we've seen epistemology already, we've seen metaphysics already. He's the first one that's going to have a real deep dive into politics and how politics should be done. And hopefully now you have a sense of why he was so motivated towards politics. His greatest work, The Republic, is the focus of it is setting up the ideal city-state. Now, the ideal city-state isn't a republic. I don't know why it's called republic. I'm sure it's some way that the meaning of the words changed with time. But he very much was focused on politics his whole life, with his greatest dialogue being a very politically focused dialogue. A little bit about his academy. So his academy is founded in 387 BC when he's 40, and it lasts until 83 BC. When we say it lasts until 83 BC, we mean the actual physical school. The school, as in the intellectual followers of Socrates, they last forever. So the followers, not of Socrates, of Plato. The followers of Plato kind of stick around forever, but the physical school itself, it lasts until 83 BC. Now, I guess I made that note, so we'll comment on that. What kind of happens with the intellectual followers of Plato, ironically enough, is they start out following Plato, then they quickly turn to skepticism, which Plato is following Socrates, who was the anti-skeptic, but his academy quickly falls into skepticism, and then they fall into what people call Middle Platonism, where they're getting back to some of Plato's original stuff, to Neoplatonism, where they start mixing Christianity and Platonism together, and that's kind of how it lasts for the majority of history. It becomes very closely tied with early Christian thought, and that's pretty much the case up until around the year 1200, when Thomas Aquinas instead mixes Christian thought with Aristotle instead of Plato, and that's, I think, currently the positions of the Roman Catholic Church. It's still Thomasism or something to that effect. They have a name that they named after Thomas Aquinas, which is just mixing Christianity and Aristotle together. But prior to that, it was Christianity and Platonism went hand in hand. And that's the way it was for a long time. His academy, so this is your first higher educational institution. First time where you can go and just continue your education in the field. Prior to that, you just got your early education in music and athletics, your physical education, your musical education, and after that, it was just you're ready to go and be a functioning member of society. And if you were to spend a lot of time pursuing philosophy after that, then you were viewed as kind of wasting your time. Well, now he actually has a place for people who want to continue education later in life to actually go and continue education and start a society of people collectively pushing forward education, body of knowledge. At his academy, inscribed above the entrance was the phrase, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here." Plato very much views a knowledge of mathematics as a prerequisite for studying philosophy. He explains some of this in The Republic. He's worried that if you expose young minds to philosophy too soon before they have rigorous training, then they'll just learn enough to go and bamboozle their opponents and then just go around bamboozling people for the thrill of being right and proving someone else wrong. So he likes the idea of mathematical education coming first. That way you get this rigorous, you develop your ability to develop a rigorous argument and make sure that you're building your philosophical arguments rigorously and can be very critical of your own arguments and know how to deal with your own arguments. So we thought mathematical education was a great foundation for starting your philosophical education. Before we get into philosophy, let's make sure that you can do mathematics. Now, not just mathematics. Some historians speculate that we have a good education of some of what you were required to do at the academy set forth in the program set forth in the Republic. When they talk about education, you remember this, they say, how should we educate our citizens? Well, one of the things they say is, once the citizen reaches an age of 20, then they should spend the next decade studying these fields in this order. So they start by studying arithmetic, and then plane geometry, and then solid geometry, that's three-dimensional geometry, and then astronomy, but astronomy with a focus on motion, how things are moving. So astronomy in its most abstract sense, the way that things move, motion in that sense, and then harmonics, in particular, the motion involved in harmonics, the way that a string moves. And so he thought that this right here was your solid foundation for now you're ready to start your philosophical education. And he has them start their philosophical education when he's setting up this ideal society at the age of 30. So from 20 to 30, that's your curriculum. Okay, any general questions about Plato before we jump into his actual metaphysics now? Maybe give you briefly how I intend to cover him. I'm going to do his metaphysics and his epistemology, then his ethics, then his politics, then his aesthetics, and try to handle it just one bite at a time. Now, the thing that's rough about that is that means we're jumping between a bunch of dialogues, because he covers a lot of points in his dialogues. His dialogues aren't just focused on one field, so hopefully it doesn't make too much of a mess of the topic. All right, so let's start by jumping into his metaphysics. Now, quickly give you a brief outline of what it looks like before we talk about it so that I don't accidentally confuse you in my terminology. In short, what does he think? He thinks that there's two worlds. There's a world up here and then a world down here. Here's the world that we live in. Here's a world of particular things, like particular chairs. So we'll do that. There's a bunch of particular chairs down in our world. This is the world that we live in. And then there's a form of chairs, which he calls chairness, that exists up here. So particulars exist in this world, and then the universal of those objects exists in the world of forms. So there's a bunch of different people down here. There's a bunch of humans down here, but humanity exists up here. There's a bunch of objects that we call equal down here, but equality exists up here. Anytime you talk about the definition of something, you're talking about the essence of that thing, right?
Yeah.
If you talk about the definition of something, you're saying, what's the essence of this thing? What makes this a chair? What's the essence of that chair? And whatever the essence of this chair is, it can't change. And whatever is the essence of this chair has to be the essence for chairs everywhere. And it's chairness that captures that notion of a chair. So he says that chairness must exist, and it doesn't exist here, so it must exist in some other world, the world of forms.
Why does it not exist here on this earth?
Show me chairness. You can show me chairs, you can't show me chairness. You can show me humans, you can't show me humanity. You can show me particular triangles, you could draw a triangle, you can't show me triangularity.
Okay, so
You can't show me the essence of triangle, you can only show me a particular triangle.
Is this world of essence physical to him? Like
It is not physical. And he's going to create an analogy he's going to use a lot of the time is the same way that we see particulars with the eyes, we see universals with the mind. Like when I'm doing a mathematical proof and I prove something about triangularity, you say, oh, I see. When you say, oh, I see, what do you mean? You mean your mind's eye saw the universal that we're talking about. And there you were exposed to the world of forms, and you just got a glimpse at it. So it's not physical, it's abstract, but it still exists. Its existence for him is kind of like the same way that you might view a soul existing. The soul is not some physical substance, but it exists. So he's going to say that these things exist, and there's a reason that it's your soul that's able to see him.
Was he saying that a human could actually think of chairness? Like
Yes.
see it through their mind and know what chairness is?
You can comprehend chairness, right? Because you call things chairs. How did you know that this was a chair?
Because it has a
Did I have to tell you that?
Because its purpose is to sit in.
Yeah, you made some reference to your notion of chairness and said, by whatever that is, this thing qualifies. And I don't have to tell you each time that we look at a chair and tell you this is also a chair.
So does a bench have the essence of a chair?
Does a bench have the essence of a chair?
To me it does.
Right, so you're going to have benchness the same way that you have chairedness, and then they're also going to be related in some sense. So the same way that both triangles and squares are plane figures, so a plane figure applies to both of them even though they're separate things. So they can have their own separate universals, but at the same time there's another universal relating them together. So things you sit on might be some higher universal, and there could be chairs and there could be benches, and depending on whatever your definition of a chair was, the essence of a chair, whatever that essence is still what you use. And for some reason, you're able to do this. I could go get you a chair that you've never seen before, and you could tell me, yeah, that's a chair. How did you do that? How did you know? How were you suddenly able to classify that thing? That's the kind of thing that we're going to talk about here. So, in a nutshell, there's the world of forms, the world of particulars. We're going to go through arguments for why this world exists, and then what this world must be like, and then epistemology is when we'll talk about how we come to know this world. So that's it in a nutshell. If anytime I say something that's confusing, let me know, and I'll try to re-explain up to that point. But so, in a nutshell, there's this world and the world of forms. Forms with a capital F, that's what we call it. If you read some of the books, Plato will often call them ideas. It's just a matter of practice now that anytime you talk about them forms instead of ideas, because we typically mean something different by the word idea now. John Locke pretty much nailed down how the word idea is used in philosophy now from that point onward, so it's not the same anymore. So in the dialogues, you'll often hear him say the idea of. If you think about that as the form of, in the sense we're going to use forms here, then you'll have a good interpretation of what's being said in those dialogues. Okay. So let's get started on his view of metaphysics. Now remember that he's just extending Socrates. So he completely agrees with Socrates that knowledge is ultimately based in knowledge of universals. Anytime we're talking about something, what we're talking about is a universal, or if we're talking about a particular, we still talk about in terms of universals. So for example, if we were talking about the properties of chairs, notice chair is a universal, right? Chair references a lot of particular objects. A lot of particular objects are chairs. So when we're talking about chair, that noun is a universal. Well, instead of talking about universal, we can still talk about a particular, like me, Donald Timpson. That's a particular thing, that's no longer universal. But even in talking about me and describing me, you still do it in terms of universals. If someone were to ask you, well, tell me about Donald Timpson so I also know Donald Timpson, then what you would start telling them about me would be universals. You might tell him he's 5'9". That's universal. He has brown hair. That's universal. He's a teacher. That's universal. However you end up describing me is going to be back in terms of universals. So universals are the foundation of all knowledge, understanding of universals. And anytime we have our definitions, it captures the essence of these universals, what all these universals have in common. So completely agrees with Socrates in that regard. Now, while Socrates limited himself to matters of ethics, that's all he was interested in. Socrates thought it was kind of absurd to try and understand the whole universe before you understand how you ought to live your life. He says, first focus on how you ought to live your life, and then, okay, once you got that figured out, go ahead and worry about these other things. Plato is going to try and work out a full system of philosophy that still works with Aristotle's ethics. So Plato is going to take on everyone, setting up all the different fields of philosophy so that Socrates' ethics is still one and the same. So, extending Socrates' philosophy. So while Socrates limited himself to matters of ethics, Plato once again wanted to resolve Parmenides and Heraclitus' metaphysics into one. So remember that as far as metaphysics went, it left off with Heraclitus and Parmenides. We had a couple philosophers try to address them. Probably the best attempt was by the atomists. So while the atomists had done this, their approach was entirely inconsistent with their ethics, and their epistemology tended towards skepticism. So if we go back to Democritus, he was able to do this, but if you remember how he thought you came to know things, he tended towards skepticism. Anytime a philosophy tends towards skepticism, it's self-defeating.
Yeah.
Does that make sense why? You say, you can't know anything. Now, do you know that? There goes your philosophy. So it's self-defeating in terms of its epistemology, and then if you remember its ethics, so you look at the atomist metaphysics, they were mechanist materialists, which means they think of you as pretty much chemicals in motion, and you're going to do what you're going to do, and choice is an absolute illusion. So that's their metaphysics. And you come and look at their ethics, and their ethics is you should make better choices. So over here they're saying choice is an illusion, but over here they're saying you need to make better choices, and over here they're saying, and you can't know anything. So here's what we know, but you can't know anything, but you can't make, there's no such thing as choices, but make better choices. It's a nightmare.
It's kind of cool though, because it's a necessity to have the opposites, the contrasts. For them to hone in on a truth, then the skeptics provide them some opportunity to do that by proving them wrong, by narrowing things down. Because the skeptics are, it's like black and white, having the contrast. I mean, in a way it is, to me.
Yeah, contrast helps bring the point to the forefront. It's definitely motivated Socrates to do what he did, the skepticism he is surrounded by. If he wasn't surrounded by the skepticism, what might have he done? So, yeah, when someone's so obviously this way, you say, no, whatever it is, it's got to be more this way, and you start opposing it. Yeah. But anyways, so with metaphysics, we kind of left off with the atomists, and then the sophists, they kind of let all that stuff alone. They said, you can't know, no point talking about it. Remember the famous, let's see, who was the first major sophist? Do you remember his name?
I know the guy who started with the G.
Gorgias?
Yeah, Gorgias.
Who came before Gorgias? he?
I don't know then.
I'm genuinely asking. I keep thinking Parmenides, and that's not it.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Wasn't it like Empedocles?
No.
Protagoras.
Protagoras.
Yeah.
Protagoras. Thank you. Protagoras. Protagoras was the first major skeptic, and his famous saying is, "Man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, of things that are that they are, of things that are not that they are not." So that was him. Gorgias was the one that says, "Nothing exists. Even if it did exist, you couldn't know about it. Even if you could know about it, you couldn't tell anyone about it, so no sense trying." So they completely dropped the metaphysical question out from the intellectual circles. That was no longer a major question on their mind because you can't know metaphysics. So metaphysics kind of was left, the atomists were in a different location, so it continued there, but in Athens at least, the question of metaphysics kind of died. So now Plato's coming back, he's going to retake up this question of metaphysics, this metaphysical question that Parmenides and Heraclitus brought up, and he's got to resolve these two, and he can't use his predecessors' views because they led to all sorts of absurdities in other fields of philosophy. So he's going to go back to the beginning. He's going to bring Parmenides and Heraclitus together, but he's got to do it in a way that's consistent with the ethics that he's ultimately going to ascribe. Right? He's out to basically prove Socrates right. That's what he's out to do. So he's got to set the metaphysics that will allow him to do that. So Plato's out to resolve Parmenides and Heraclitus while maintaining a consistent epistemology, ethics, politics, and aesthetics. He's going to have a complete system of philosophy, all consistent with each other. It will have its problems, but at least it will all be consistent with itself. So let's jump into some of his arguments. So first, the foundation of pretty much all his metaphysics is the idea that universals must be knowable. They're the foundation for all knowledge, so universals must be knowable. They're the basis for all knowledge. Now, since universals are knowable, since all knowledge is in terms of universals, universals must be knowable, since we know something. Basically, that's his premise. We know something. We must know something. So, since universals are knowable, they must exist. Now, he's taking a Parmenides argument here, for thou canst not know what is not. You can't know what is not. So, if you know something, whatever you know is. Thou canst not know what is not. So since universals are knowable, they must in some sense exist. In some sense. They must exist in reality. Somehow, some way, they must exist. So then the natural question is, okay, maybe they do exist in some sense, but then where and in what sense do these universals exist? Where does the redness exhibited by a fire truck and a fire hydrant exist? I don't have to tell you each time I show you something red, hey, and this is also red. You've already got that. You say, yep, redness applies to that. Yep, redness applies to that. So you know that redness applies to all these things. And so redness must exist in some sense. So the question is, where and how does this redness exist? So Plato gives several arguments that there must be two distinct worlds, a world of particulars, which we currently inhabit, and a world of universals, only accessible to the mind or soul. These are kind of one and the same in early philosophy. Mind and soul, same thing. Call it the world of forms, what I briefly sketched out before. So he's going to give a bunch of arguments as to why this is the case. Good so far?
Yeah.
All right, so we'll go through, I think I have 4 general arguments that we'll go through in no particular order, so this is just argument 1. Okay, so you might be tempted to say, if I say, where does the redness of a fire truck exist? You might say that that redness just exists as part of the fire truck. It exists in the fire truck. Redness is just a property of that fire truck. So it exists as a part of that fire truck. So Plato argues that universals can't just be a part of particulars. In the same way that you know that 2 particulars are separate things, you can also classify universals and particulars as separate things. So, for example, you know that this globe and this printer are 2 separate things. How do you know that those are 2 separate things? Well, one's white and one's blue and tan. One's rectangular, one's spherical. One prints paper, one displays the world. They have drastically different properties. Therefore, they're 2 separate objects. They can't be the same thing because they have drastically different properties. If something's going to exist as a part of some higher thing, then it has to share some of the properties. So I am a part of the Timpson family. So you might say about the Timpson family, I don't know the general things you say about, what are they? Utes fans. The Timpson family, they're a bunch of Utes fans, which means me, as a part of the Timpson family, I should be a Utes fan. They're short, so me, as part of the Timpson family, I should be short. So whatever properties should apply to the whole should also apply to that individual part. So if you have two things with drastically different properties, you can't say one's just a part of the other. That's ultimately the type of reasoning that he's going for here. Does that make sense so far what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Well, what about your red fire truck? And compare that to a red apple. The redness is in both, but they're not the same thing.
Well, he's going to argue that the redness and the apple you're trying to make it a part of are so drastically different that they have to be separate. He's going to argue universals and particulars
But they share redness.
are separate.
So how is he explaining that?
Well, he's not going to contrast the apple with the fire truck. He's going to contrast the universal with the particular to show that the universal can't just be part of the particular. Because none of the properties that apply to the particular apply to the universal.
Okay.
That's the way that he's going to do it.
So the universal is the fundamental. It's the truth. It's the fundamental truth.
Well, all he's going to argue here is they have to be separate. They can't be the same thing. That's all he's going to argue for in this argument. So, let's see what example I had put up here. How do you know that my dog Bob and my cat Bill are two separate entities? And that Bob isn't somehow a part of or a property of Bill? So I have a dog and a cat. How do you know that they're not the exact same thing, or that one's not just a part of another the same way that a dog's paw is part of it? Because they have drastically different properties. Bob's big, Bill's small, Bob's brown, Bill's white, whatever. You list the properties of the cat, the properties of the dog. They're completely separate things. They have drastically different properties. So Plato says, the same way that you claim that you can distinguish between two particulars, I can do the same thing to distinguish between particulars and universals. So Plato does the same thing with universals and particulars. He demonstrates that they are drastically different, that they have drastically different properties, since they both exist in reality, and since they are completely separate, they have drastically different properties, so they're separate, then there must be two worlds. So that's kind of the high-level logic that we're going to get here. So I know that the universal, redness, and the fire truck are two separate things. They're no longer the same thing. This isn't just a part of this. They're two separate things.
Okay.
Thou canst not know what is not, so they must both exist. You know both these things, so they must both exist in reality somehow. Since they're separate, they don't exist in the same place. They must exist in two separate places. And since we never see this thing, then it must exist somewhere that's not this world, because all we can see is this. So it must exist in some other world.
Is it limited to the two worlds?
He's not going to necessarily split it up into just two worlds so far. All he's going to say is, we know that this exists, and it's separate from this thing, and wherever it exists, it doesn't exist in this world, so it must exist somewhere else. Who knows? Some other world, some other place, wherever it is, that's where it exists. But it exists somewhere that's not in this world, since they're two separate things that must both exist. That's all we've got so far. Okay, so continuing this argument one. So, how does he list the different ways that they vary? How do we know that these are drastically different things? Well, here's a bunch of the properties that he points out that are drastically different for these two things. So how do universals and particulars differ? First off, plurality versus one. There's many, many, many particulars, but there's only one universal.
Yeah.
There's many triangles, there's only one triangularity. If I were to give you a proof about triangularity, you say, okay, well that works for that triangularity, but what about this other triangularity? What are you talking about? There's only one triangularity. Once I proved the Pythagorean theorem, I proved it. I didn't prove it for a particular triangularity. Once I prove something about triangles, that abstract, I'm using triangularity instead of saying triangles as the abstract, but maybe that's more natural language for us. Once I prove about triangles, that universal abstract, I proved about any triangle you can think of it. There's not two different triangularities. There's not two different definitions of triangles. There's just one definition. Once I prove about that one, it's true for that
So
triangularity.
there's many different triangles, but there are, the principles of the triangle are the same.
Right, so when I prove, for example, that the angle sum of a triangle is 180 degrees, I didn't just prove it for one triangle, I proved about triangularity, the one and only triangularity. I showed it works for that definition of triangle that you have, that universal, that essence of triangles. There's only one essence of triangles, only one definition of triangles, only one triangularity, although there's many triangles. Or, more concrete example, humanity versus humans. There's only one humanity, there's lots of humans. When we say that's a crime against humanity, we don't say which humanity, this humanity or that humanity. No, it's a crime against humanity. There's only one humanity, the thing shared by all humans, the essence of humans. The universal is the one in the many particulars. Back to the one in the many concept that Daly started us all out with. So I feel like we understand this difference. So next difference. Motion or change. Remember that change and motion are very intimately related in how they talk about these things. So sometimes they switch the words out interchangeably, meaning the same thing. So motion or change versus rest or unchanging. So particulars, they change all the time, right? Here's this marker. Atoms are decaying, whatever else is happening, it's changing. Even if we can't see the exact changes that are going on, it's constantly changing all the time. And yet it's still a marker, it's still a marker, it's still a marker. Because markerness doesn't change. What it means to be a marker, the essence of markers, that never changes, although a particular does. So particulars are constantly changing all the time. Their motion, they're constantly changing. Whereas universals are never changing. What it means to be a triangle now is what it meant to be a triangle 100 years ago is what it means to be a triangle 10,000 years into the future. A triangle is a triangle. That essence, that definition, that's eternal. But the particulars here, they're changing all the time. Let's see what I said here. Particulars are in a Heraclitean flux, while universals are always the same. Good with this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so our next one, physical versus abstract. So, well, this one probably already makes pretty good sense. I can hold a red marker, I cannot hold redness. I can hold equal sums of money, but I cannot hold equality. Universals, essences, are always abstract concepts, whereas particulars are always physical entities that we can touch. Good on that one? And then finally, particulars are known by the senses, while universals are known by the mind, or by reason, or by the mind's eye. When you see something about universals, when you see a proof, you see it up here. When you see the triangle I draw on the board, you see it with your eye. So particulars are known by the eye, universals are known by the mind. Good with that?
I guess that's where all the skeptics went wrong.
With what?
Because they weren't thinking of the mind, they're just thinking of the senses.
Yeah, so common thing with the skeptics, we'll get to this when we get to the epistemology, but they say all knowledge has to come through the senses, and the senses can mislead you. So how can you trust them? Because what looks right to you might not look right to me, and so who's right now? And what is it really? The water, you might remember the common ones of 3 waters example. You got cold water, room temperature water, hot water. You stick your hand in the hot water, then in the middle one you say, oh, how cool. I stick mine in the cold one, then I stick it in that one, I say, oh, how warm. Here we are, having drastically different experiences with the exact same thing. So our senses can't give us reality. It just gives us our perception. So yes, very much down that avenue. Anyways, so as you can see, they drastically differ from each other, particulars and universals, completely different properties, and so they cannot be the same thing. So therefore, there are 2 worlds. The world of universals, or the world of the forms, and the world of particulars, or this world. That's his first argument. Any questions on that one before we go to the next one? Okay, next argument. The next argument is, where do we get our knowledge of perfections? So imagine I ask you to go grab me 2 sticks of equal length. You completely understand what I'm saying when I ask you to do that, right? And yet, go grab any 2 sticks you want. Are they exactly equal in length?
Probably.
No, they're not. You're never going to get two sticks absolutely equal in length. When have you ever come across two particulars that were exactly equal in some way? When have you ever seen this concept of equality that you seem to perfectly understand in your mind?
Well, it depends on the measurement device.
But there's going to be, however slight, always some change, some difference. So you don't ever see two things perfectly equal, and yet you completely understand the concept. That's one example of what he's talking about here. So where do we get our knowledge of these perfections? How do you know equality if you've never seen equality before?
So what does he mean exactly by perfections?
Perfectly equal. Something that is complete, something that can't be improved upon. Yeah. So perceptible things, the things of this world, change, and things that change cannot be perfect. Furthermore, there are no perceptibles of many abstract concepts that we have perfect notions of. There's no such thing as a perceptible triangle, let alone a perfect triangle. So for example, I might draw this on the board. You might say, oh, is that a triangle? You're tempted to say that's a triangle, but now be critical of me and think, is that really a triangle? What exactly is a triangle? It's a two-dimensional planar object with certain properties. This isn't a two-dimensional object. This is ink on a whiteboard. However much it's sticking out some, that ink's sticking out. This isn't two-dimensional. There's ink on there sticking out this way. So if we want it to be completely two-dimensional, we got to get rid of any way it exists in the third dimension. Okay, we're closer to a triangle now. So you know triangles, but you've never seen a triangle. So you have this notion of perfect triangle, sure, but you've never even seen an instance of a triangle, and yet you have that knowledge in your mind. So, therefore, there are no instances of perceptible perfections in this world. We must have knowledge of perfections, for we often call things imperfect, and so perfections must exist. We know that that wasn't a triangle, so we have a notion of what a triangle is, since we're able to classify things as not that.
Yeah.
We know two things aren't perfectly equal, so we know what equality is. Thus, perfections must exist, and yet they do not exist in this world. So, where do they exist? Thus, perfections exist in the same world as universals, the world of forms. The universals are perfections as well. Now, we still are dealing with our knowledge of it, so we're also going to get a piece of his argument for the immortality of the soul. So, if the perfections are not a part of this world, how did we obtain our knowledge of them? So, you might be content with, okay, there's two worlds. There's our world, there's the world of the forms where the perfections exist. That still doesn't tell me how I know of equality. How did I ever get that notion in my head if I've never seen these perfectly equal things? So, if the perfections are not a part of this world, how did we obtain our knowledge of them? We must have existed in the world of forms prior to this life and gained our knowledge and standards of perfection there. When did you get your knowledge of equality? Prior to your birth. You can't say you learned it anywhere in this world. You didn't come across two particulars and say, oh, there's equality, and yet you have it. Where'd you get it? You must have got it in a prior existence. You must have seen them, you must have been over here, learned about them, and now you're over here. So you must have been over here prior to your birth, and you were born down into here, which also explains why your soul is a lot like the things over here versus the things over here. And why it seems like your soul understands these things just fine, and you can see things with your soul here that aren't here. So, must have existed in the world of forms prior to this life and gained our knowledge of standards of our knowledge and standards of perfection there. Therefore, not only is there another world of forms, but we are born into this world with these innate ideas about the world of forms. This also implies that the soul must have been able to exist independent of the body. So we're getting this notion of you are a soul encased in a body. And your soul existed here, came, got encased in your body, and now it's in the world of particulars. And he'll continue the argument later for when you die, it's back like that. But, so there's his second argument for...
It's like spiritual creation and physical creation. everything's created spiritually before it is physically.
Yes,
It's very similar to that.
it is similar to that. But over here, these things are universal, never changing, always have been, always will be. So the notion that the forms are created, he'd disagree with. But I think other than that, I think it's a good analogy. Okay, so that's our second argument. Our third argument. Which do we understand first? Universals or particulars? Now you might think, first we experience a bunch of particulars and then we learn the universal, right? I go and I see a bunch of dogs, and by seeing a bunch of dogs I finally understand the abstraction dog. So it's by seeing a bunch of particulars that we learn the universal. You might be tempted to think that way. Plato would say, nope, that can't be the way that this happens. We can't abstract universals from particulars because this presupposes we know which particulars to abstract from. How do you know which things to pick as dogs to determine your notion of dogness? You had to already start by picking the dogs to abstract your concept from. How would you know which things to pick?
Your parents told you.
Your parents told you, but that just pushes the question back once. How'd they know? So, example, if you want to know a universal like cat, you might think you collect before your mind particular instances of cats and then abstract away what they all have in common. Now suppose I ask you now to define food this way. I want you to give me a definition of food. I want you to explain to me the universal food. You say, how am I supposed to do that? Easy. Go out in the world, find a bunch of particular instances of food, see what they have in common, and tell me. How are you going to pick the particular instances to begin with? You say, I don't know what to go pick as instances of food to tell you what all food have in common. I say, aha, you see the problem. You have to know what food is before you can go find the particulars to abstract from. So don't tell me that universals are just abstracting from particulars if you can't do this. You see the problem?
Yeah.
All right, so suppose I ask you now to define food this way, just look at all the particular instances and abstract away what they all have in common. You're utterly at a loss. You can't give me a definition of food this way. Therefore, in order to recognize a particular instance, I realize that's kind of programming language. Are you okay with me saying particular instance of a universal? Sorry, this is such natural terminology to me because of my profession that I didn't even think about that until now, and I probably have that a lot in there. So, in programming, we do this a lot, all the time. We create a universal, and then we create objects of that universal. We create a notion of chairness, and then we create a particular chair, which we call an instance of chairness. So I'm accidentally going to use that all the time, most likely since I have it here. That's what I mean by an instance. A particular instance of that abstraction.
Okay.
So this is a particular instance of chairness.
Okay.
Sorry, if I throw other terminology in there like that, just call me on it. Anyways, so therefore, in order for us to recognize a particular instance of catness, or whatever abstraction you want to talk about, we must already know the universal. So the only way I need to classify, the only way I need to abstract from 3 different dogs to determine what dogness is I already knew that those were 3 dogs. So we have to know the universal before we can know the particular. I have to know dogness before I can call something a dog. I can't get dogness from dogs. That's circular. That's the problem. Now, since we recognize instances, we, our souls, must have come to know universals prior to this life in some other world, the world of forms. So you came across catness in the world of forms. And so, down in this world, you see a bunch of cats, and it reminds you of what you already knew. And you say, oh yeah, catness, I've seen that before. And so now you remember catness, and that's how you learn catness, down here. So, we'll get into his epistemology later, but to help you understand now how this process works, he calls all learning is really just recollection of what you learned over here. Since all knowledge is based in universals exist over here, all knowledge is recollection, because in a pre-existence, you were over here and knew it all. So he says the same way that you might think, well, after high school, if I asked you to name a bunch of people in your class, you might only be able to name 3 of them. But then if I start showing you a couple instances of people who used to be in your class, you might suddenly remember everyone in your class and say, oh yeah, because I might show you John. And then you might remember, oh yeah, John, he was always with Tim and Alfred. Those guys always hung out together. And you might start making other connections. So he says the same thing's going on here. You come to this world, you forgot about Katniss, and then you see a couple cats and you're like, oh, it comes back to me. Of course, Katniss. And now you don't need to be told anymore, and you can start identifying yourself. Now you've been reminded of it. So you came into this world already knowing chairness, but you don't quite remember. Then I show you a few chairs, and you say, oh yes, chairness, it comes back to me now. And now I can go grab any weird instance of chair and show it to you, and you're able to say, yep, that's a chair too, yep, that's a chair too. Because now you got your knowledge again. You were reminded of it. So that's kind of how his epistemology works. We'll go into more detail next week, most likely, but that's an overview of it. Anyways, so here's his third argument. Since we had to know universals before particulars, and only particulars are in this world, then we must have got universals in a prior existence, world of forms, so this world must exist. Any questions on that argument? Okay, fourth argument. What must reality be like for knowledge to be possible? This is going to go back using a bunch of Heraclitean and Parmenidean arguments. So Heraclitus and Parmenides agreed that a world of change implies contradictions, right?
Yeah.
Change means it's becoming what it was not. So they both agreed that change implies a contradiction. And if contradictions are allowable, then nothing can be known. Right? Because if we allow contradictions, and I know that Peter is not a 6-foot gorilla, contradiction of that is Peter is a 6-foot gorilla, and so how can I know anything? So, if contradictions are allowable, then nothing can be known. Therefore, if knowledge is possible, reality must be composed of unchanging entities. Right? Good so far? Change implies a contradiction. If reality is knowable, thou canst not know what is not. So if reality is knowable, it must be composed of things that aren't contradictions, so that aren't changing. Furthermore, sophists say that perceptions of perceptibles are flawed. We cannot rely on our physical senses to communicate knowledge to us about the world around us. We have our own subjective experiences of different objects, so how can we say for sure that this is the way it is? So Plato is actually going to agree with both these guys. He says, yep, you're right. Plato agrees. Since knowledge is possible, then there must exist some unchanging reality that our knowledge is ultimately based in, the world of forms. So you're right, knowledge has to be based on things that don't change, and knowledge has to be based on realities. Therefore, there's this world of the forms where nothing changes, it's a perfectly static world, and all our knowledge is based in this reality. Furthermore, since our physical senses cannot communicate knowledge to us, we must come to understand it purely through our reason. So we're going to see the roots of what we call rationalism spawning up here. So we don't have any experiences of universals here. I can't show you through your senses that all triangles sum up to 180 degrees. That's something you see in here. It's something you see with your mind's eye. When you say, I see, as I'm writing a proof, it's not because you see the physical lines I was writing on the board. You always saw those. That wasn't the problem. The problem was reasoning through it, seeing it with your mind. So he's going to say, yep, you can deceive my senses. The reason, that's infallible. So here's where you can come and actually know things. Your senses, they might mislead you, but your mind, that won't mislead you. So you can follow, you can basically use logic to come to know truths. Is what he's saying there. Good so far? So, therefore, there's two worlds, the world of forms and this world. Furthermore, all true knowledge is knowledge of the world of forms, since it is the only knowledge that is possible. All knowledge has to be based in things that don't change, because things that change imply contradiction. Change implies a contradiction. Everything in this world changes. So our knowledge can't be about the things of this world. So all our knowledge has to be about the forms, the things in the world of the forms. Therefore, everything that we call knowledge of this world is opinion at best. Knowledge of this world? Yep, That's true, that's absolute, that's never changing. But the things you think you know about this world, that's opinion at best. All real true knowledge is here. This is the world of changing, the world of contradiction. So here you have opinion at best.
So how could you apply this to the modern scientific method?
The modern scientific method rejects this metaphysics, because the modern scientific method is based in Aristotle. So Aristotle is completely opposed to Plato. Maybe going back and talking about that picture at the beginning, now that we have some of this, we can come to understand it. So Plato, he's standing in the picture and he's pointing upwards at the world of form, saying that's where reality is, that's what we know about. That's real reality, not this world. And Aristotle, he's holding out his hand like this. Now Plato's pointing up to the one universal. Aristotle's got his hand extended, pointing at all the particulars. Aristotle's saying, no, this is reality. It's not that, this is a reality, and we have knowledge, and we know about this world, this stuff. So they're completely opposed to each other. Aristotle's the foundation of the scientific method. So it doesn't. No, all mathematical objects are universals, and so all mathematical knowledge is true knowledge. So one more reason why you can see how he would use that as a foundation for getting into philosophy. You're exposing yourself to learning true knowledge, some true knowledge, some of the universals. In philosophy, you come to understand well, we'll get to that later.
One
The
challenge
foundations
I've
of
had
knowledge.
from day one with philosophy, that all this that we've gone through, is that my natural tendency is to measure everything that we're being exposed to against what my own sense of, is that true or not? Rather than just absorbing it as it's just information, this is just people's ideas about things.
Yeah, so a lot of this, a major part of the value of this is seeing the evolution of the thoughts to what we already know,
Yeah.
rather than being exposed to, oh, this is the way I should actually think. So when I advocate, typically to high school students, I say Plato's dialogues are a great place to get some good tactics for argument. Don't trust the premises, don't trust the conclusions, but it's a good way to get a feel for how to be critical of your own position. So that's why I think Plato's great for. Aristotle, I think he just gives a great foundation, and much of our modern knowledge is based off of Aristotle. And then the second thing I always warn of is, you might remember way back day one, I did the 1 is equal to ... is equal to -1 proof. You remember that?
Yeah.
As my warning that just because it seems convincing, don't buy into it. There can be subtle ways that slowly deceives you until it leads you to conclusions that are completely contrary to common sense. So your best fallback in all philosophical arguments is common sense. Because ultimately that's what it takes as a premise. Philosophy, the best way I can think of to give a notion of what is philosophy. Philosophy is inductively reasoning on common experience to premises, and then looking at the logical implication of those. And that's the best that you can do. And so don't ignore your common experience, common sense notions of things. And if you start out with those basic notions and you come to some conclusion that's completely against those, you just undercut yourself.
That's
and it
also
doesn't
a
work.
premise of our judicial system is reason. What's reasonable?
Yeah, the judicial system, well, that you use what we call abductive reasoning, but it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the same criterion that we try to use for history as well, when we have to reconstruct particular events. So history and the judicial system are doing very similar science, if you want to call it that, studying, thinking, probably a better word. Okay, fourth argument. I think we understand. Right? Good. Any questions on that one? No? All right. So, moving forward. Okay, so Plato has answered Heraclitus, Parmenides, and the skeptics with this two-world approach. An intelligible world of universals called the world of forms, and this physical or sensible world, I'll probably switch those out interchangeably, mix them up, which is composed of particulars. The forms exist independent of man's minds, independent of the universe, even though they are not physical, Plato still envisioned these forms as actually existing entities. We already went over that a little bit, kind of like we view the soul as actually existing. So even though they're universals, even though they're not physical entities, they're still actual entities that actually exist as entities. There's a form for every universal, for example, justice, courage, the number 2, as well as hair, mud, dirt. Universals for everything. And they all exist here. Anytime you have a universal, anytime you have an essence of something, you have something existing here in the world of forms to account for that universal. Otherwise, you couldn't know it. If it's knowable, it must exist here somehow. Thou canst not know what is not. Since definitions depend on the essence of a thing, and since essences don't change, the forms don't change. Now remember, it's not any universal notion you can come up with in your head. It has to actually capture the essence of the thing to be a form. So you cannot use as a definition, man is a featherless biped, because that doesn't get at the essence of what it means to be a man. It might just so happen that you exist at a particular time in history where every featherless biped on the face of the earth is a man. So it just so happens that everything that is a featherless biped is a man. But that does not make that a valid definition. The definition has to get the essence of the thing. And you remember the counter to this definition, because that actually was a definition of man at one point, and some clever guy went, grabbed a chicken, plucked it, said, behold, man. Doesn't work. Featherless biped doesn't get at the essence of what it means to be a man. So these have to capture these essences. Essences don't change from day to day, year to year, month to month. Featherless biped might work one time, but later it might not work. So it didn't get at the essence of the thing. So when we're talking about the definition, the universal has to get at the essence of the thing. And that is what the form is. And it doesn't change with time. What it means to be man doesn't change with time. Whatever that definition is what that definition is. So let's look at, probably should have mentioned this a little bit better on how we dealt with Heraclitus and Parmenides. Kind of notice what we did here. We said, okay, Heraclitus, you're right, change implies a contradiction and this world is in a Heraclitean flux. You're right, and that's how this world is. Parmenides, you said that the world's not changing and it has to be completely static with no change, and that's what this world is. So you're both kind of right. So that's how he's dealing with Heraclitus and Parmenides. How's he dealing with the skeptics? Skeptics say, you can't know anything about this world. He says, yep, you can have opinion at best, but via your mind, you can have knowledge about this world. So no, there actually is such thing as objective truth, objective beauty, objective good, because they exist over here. So your argument about the senses being invalid, that just tells you, okay, we just have opinion about this, but we can still have knowledge about this. So that's how he's addressed his opponents. Heraclitus and Parmenides by splitting it in two, and the skeptics by splitting it in two. So we've handled everyone who he had to handle. Plato has very Pythagorean notions in his philosophy. If you want to slapstick way of describing Plato's philosophy, he takes Socrates, throws in some Platonism while answering Heraclitus, Parmenides, and the skeptics. That's what Plato does with his philosophy. So we're going to see a lot of Pythagorean elements show up in it. And you might remember, thinking clear back to the Pythagoreans, they had two columns of different properties that they split the world into, and you'll notice that he has some of those same qualities. So the world of universals, you have one there, where you have many in the world of particulars. The world of universals is at rest, you have motion in the world of particulars. The world of universals is eternal, the essence of a thing doesn't change, it is what it is forever. World of particular things are temporal, they come and go. World of universals is non-physical, they're abstractions, they're not physical. World of particulars, we have physical things. World of universal is known by thought, known by the mind, known by the soul. World of particulars is known, probably a better word right there would have been experienced by the senses. So we have these two, we list the properties of these different worlds. And now the question Plato wants to answer is, okay, so which of these worlds is the real world? Which one is reality? So we know that we got these two different worlds, here's their properties. Now which of these is a more real world? Which is reality? And that's what a bunch of his next arguments are going to be targeted at. Kind of understand the question?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's going to do an analysis of how we use this word real all the time. So first off, for a thing to exist, it cannot be contradictory, which implies it doesn't change. The things of this world both are and are not. They change, so they both are and are not. And so the world of forms is more real than this world, in this respect. Follow that? Next. Only real things can be known. Thou canst not know what is not. We have knowledge of the world of forms, but we have no knowledge of this world. We just have opinion of this world. And so, with this respect, the world of forms is more real. So here's another way that the world of forms seems to be more real. Next one. The real is the more perfect. Notice that you use the word real like this all the time. That's real apple pie. Doesn't mean that the other apple pie is somehow fake apple pie, doesn't exist. It's imaginary apple pie, it's hallucinatory apple pie. No, that's not what you mean. You mean that real apple pie is somehow more perfect. If I use canned apples from the store, or I have an orchard in my backyard, and I go pick apples from the orchard and use those ones, you probably call the one where I picked my apples the more real apple pie. Or what does it mean to be a real American? If someone hates America, are they a real American? They're still a citizen, but you're saying that someone who's more patriotic is more of a real American, a more perfect American, than the person who hates America. So he points out that we also use real in this sense, to mean the more perfect. And the world of perfections is the world of forms. And so the world of forms is more real than this world. Okay, another way that we use the word real is the original versus the imitation. Now, chairs are only chairs to the extent that they imitate chairness. So particulars imitate the universal in order to be even classified that way. So the original is more real than its imitations. If I went and took a picture of the Mona Lisa, and I said, I may sell it to you at 1% the value of the Mona Lisa, that's $1 million, please. You say, no, that's not the real Mona Lisa. It's just an imitation of the Mona Lisa. Right? So another way that we use the word real. And particulars are just imitations of the form. And so once again, the world of forms is more real. So we looked at it from a bunch of different ways, thinking about the word real. Every time this world comes out better than this world. So this must be the real reality and not this. So not only is the world of forms real, it's more real than this reality, whatever this is. Therefore, true reality is the world of forms. Follow each of those? Any questions on that? Okay. Now we'll get to some of his more Pythagorean notions covered in the Timaeus. Maybe some conversation about this Timaeus for a second. So, we say that the Republic is Plato's most complete, most influential work now. If you were to ask the question, what's Plato's greatest work 1,000 years ago? Everyone would say the Timaeus. Why would they say the Timaeus? Because there came a long stretch in Western civilization where the Timaeus was the only Platonic work known. And the Timaeus contains a lot of Pythagorean notions, so a lot of those kind of out there religious notions. So some of the more religious ideas are going to be captured in the Timaeus. The Timaeus is also one of Plato's latest works. Maybe talk about some of the historians' views relative to this work, which I disagree with, but I'll tell you what they say. So since the Timaeus is one of his later works, and since it pretty much advocates Platonism in there, then a lot of people, not Platonism, Pythagoreanism in there. I don't know if I've been saying Platonism the whole time. Timaeus has a lot of Pythagorean elements. Okay. Anyways, so since this is one of his later works, then a lot of people say that Plato converted to complete Pythagoreanism there at the end of his life because he wrote this work which has a lot of Pythagorean elements. So that's what historians say, which I disagree with.
And the Republic was written before the Timaeus?
The Republic is written before the Timaeus. So the Republic is viewed as, if you want to get a general feel for all of Plato's philosophy, the Republic is the work to go to. It has some of everything all together in one nice piece. The Timaeus is a work where, strangely enough, Plato no longer uses Socrates as a mouthpiece. he actually uses Timaeus as a mouthpiece in this one, and Timaeus is just a Pythagorean, and so he's expressing Pythagorean views, which is why some people say that Plato switched to Pythagoreanism at the end of his life. Now, I don't think that that's what happened. I think he was coming to the end of his life. He thought to himself, I want to have a complete system, and so he tried to give an explanation for the things that we're going to go into. He didn't have a worked out explanation, so I think he borrowed from the Pythagoreans and used Timaeus as a mouthpiece instead of Socrates to help express that view. Now that's my own personal speculation on it as opposed to the great geniuses. I gotta tell you some of this because it just bugged me so bad. These experts on Plato drive me nuts. When I first came across Plato, I just read the dialogues. And then later I would hear some people talk about Plato, and there was so much animosity against Plato, it just baffled me. And they'd say things about Plato, and they'd take it to a massive extreme, and it baffled me why they would do this. One example, Bertrand Russell. So Plato in his Republic, he advocates that the ruling class, first off, the system of government he's setting up, the ideal city-state, is just a couple thousand people. So it's very, very small, and he advocates that the rulers should live a communal lifestyle. They should have all their property in common. Bertrand Russell takes this, and he pushes it to the whole point where he thinks Plato would have supported Soviet Union Russia. He goes to that extreme of conclusion. There's no doubt that Plato would have called what they had a tyranny, which he thinks is the worst form of government, so it's just completely absurd, but he pushes this position, which kind of baffled me, because you see this kind of animosity from a lot of people. And it wasn't until I came across the experts on Plato that I started to understand it. These experts on Plato take him to such an extreme, the opposite way, thinking that he just has so much depth and meaning and beauty in every little thing he says. There's a German philosopher who says, the first time I taught the Republic, yeah, we got through the whole thing. The second time I had to teach the Republic, we didn't get past the first sentence in the book. And the first sentence in the book is something to the extent of, the other day I went down to the Piraeus. It's Socrates talking in the first person in the Republic. He says, the other day I went down to the Piraeus. And so this guy can go on for hours about, already he's talking about this great wise man coming from the city of Athens and descending to us lowly people here at the Piraeus where the common people dwell. And of course it's close to the docks, and docks is where known dirty people live. And so he's coming to the dirty people, and since it's down, even though obviously the shore is lower than the city, down must mean somehow worse, and he's descending. And they can go on, applying all this meaning instead of the same way that anyone starts a conversation with you. Oh yeah, the other day I went down to Salt Lake. You're not attaching all this deep, deep, deep meaning going on and on for hours and hours about how much meaning Plato just packed into that one little sentence. And so it's just absurd. And so you listen to that for 20 minutes and you can start to understand why people are very annoyed at these experts. And Bertrand Russell gives my favorite criticism of these experts. He says, it's funny how experts on Plato would have never been qualified to learn from Plato in the first place. Because Plato's first prerequisite, if you're going to get to the academy, you got to know math. And most of them don't know very much math. So that's my little offshoot on the experts on Plato. They drive me nuts listening to him. Supposed experts. Anyways, so this work, the Timaeus, it's very influential. It might be more influential in the Republic based on some people you ask. Because when you have all the works together, everyone agrees that the Republic is Plato's most complete work. But just perchance through history, there came a good stretch in early Christianity where this was the only known work of Plato. And since it has some of the Pythagorean, more religious aspects, which tend to work really well with Christianity, it was very influential in tying these two together. There would have been a long stretch in history where this book was second only to the Bible, in other words. So it had major historical impact for early Christians. Early Christians being hundreds of years after Christ, by the way. Christianity was illegal in Rome for like the first 200 years of its existence. So when we're talking early Christians, we're still talking hundreds of years after Christ. Early Christians are a lot closer to, you're a lot closer to George Washington than early Christians are to Christ, to give you a sense of the gap between them when we say early Christians. Anyways, that's why it's such an influential work. So we'll go over some of the ideas that were expressed there because they kind of finish topping off his metaphysics. So mostly this material is referencing the Timaeus. So what's the nature of this world? Plato says it's a reflection or a projection of true reality, this thing. So our world is a reflection of true reality that both kind of is and kind of isn't. This is, the void isn't, and our reality tends to be somewhere between those two. And I'll try and tie those better here in a second, but try and give you an analogy here. So a multi-light source spinning around you, casting multiple moving shadows, is kind of like the world of forms creating this world. So if you're a form, and I were to put you in a dark room, now we have light sources spinning around you, multiple light sources, so it's casting multiple shadows of you. That's you, the form, casting a bunch of moving particulars that move and change, right? As your shadow grows, it might move on to some object, makes it bigger, smaller. So the shadows can change while you're staying statically there as the light source moves around you. So there could be multiple shadows if we have multiple light sources, and they could all be moving and changing, yet you're just standing still there. That's kind of like how it works with these forms. So these forms are static, they don't change, but their particulars, their reflections into this world, do change and move and all that kind of stuff. So just an analogy. So there's a perfect, immovable, non-physical reality projecting itself outwards to create the appearance of an imperfect, changing, physical world. This world is somehow just a reflection of this reality. Reality, the world of forms, projects itself into the void, nothingness. And since the void is three-dimensional, the projection creates three-dimensional reflections or physical objects. You follow that so far?
Yeah.
So instead of the light source shining onto the walls, it's more like the form is being reflected into the void. The void is a medium that captures the reflection somehow. And since the void, empty space, nothingness, the void, is three-dimensional, the reflections are three-dimensional. And our name for three-dimensional objects are physical objects. You follow that so far? So, that's a long sentence. Have to restart. Okay, so reality projects itself into the void, nothingness. And since the void is three-dimensional, the projections create 3D reflections, or physical objects, that both are and are not. They're kind of real and kind of not real. They're kind of not real because they're projections into the void, nothingness, but they're more than nothingness, but they're not perfect reality. They're this in-between reality and nothingness. So they're not nothingness, they're not reality, they're somehow something in between. And this is something that you need to keep in mind for when we talk about his views on, well, we can kind of say here, that's why we can have knowledge of this world. Knowledge is about what is, and we can have opinions in this world. Opinions are kind of between knowledge and ignorance. They both kind of are knowing, but kind of not knowing at the same time. So we have opinions here in this world of kind of realities. Kind of exists, but kind of doesn't. So since a thing's both being and not being, what it is and it isn't, is a sufficient condition for change, change is allowed to occur in this world. It both is and isn't. Things both are and are not, which is why they change. So Heraclitus was right.
How is nothingness 3D?
The void?
Yeah.
So he's borrowing from the atomist here. So the atomist says there's atoms and the void, right? And atoms are reality, they're what exists. And the void is nothingness, it's what doesn't exist. So you have reality moving around in nothingness. Atoms and the void, that's all there is. So he's taking the void the same way that the atomist used it. Empty space, the void, nothing. Those are all synonymous in the way that he's using it. Which is three-dimensional, right? Just empty space, three-dimensional? No?
Yes.
I'm not sure you're getting lost in there. If you're thinking empty space and nothingness aren't the same thing, that's correct, but they're viewing them as the same thing, the same way that the atomist did. So if you allow nothingness and a pure vacuum, empty space, to be the same thing, then hopefully this now makes sense.
Yeah.
If you allow that confusion. So you think you're good now?
Yeah.
Okay, so that explains this world, how there's change in this world, how this world kind of is and kind of isn't. Okay, now how did this world come into existence? Now, both the world of forms and the void are eternal. So those never came into existence, those will never go away. But this world is seen as not eternal. So how did it come into existence, since the things of this world are temporal? Both the world of forms and the void are eternal and have always existed. Now we have the myth of the Demiurge, which he gives forth in Timaeus about how everything came to be. So myth of the Demiurge, Demiurge roughly in translation comes out the craftsman or something to that effect. The Demiurge, seeing the universe in an unorganized state, and with an eye on the world of forms, gave order to the universe by shaping matter into imitations of the forms. This initial ordering introduced all the natural laws into our universe that govern everything. So the Demiurge comes along, decides that he's going to organize this reality into existence. Looking at the world of forms, he tries to imitate it in this 3D nothingness void the best that he can. And what he puts in place is what we call natural laws. So remember that in early Greek philosophy, you're always talking about what exists by nature and what exists by convention. What exists by convention is a man's creation. What exists by nature is what the Demiurge put forth in the very beginning. It's what's eternal in terms of this universe, what has always been the case for this universe. So the Demiurge puts all natural order into the universe, modeling off of the world of forms, and convention, anything that exists by convention is man-made after that.
Have we talked about natural laws up to this point, the different philosophers? I mean, have they defined the natural laws up to this point that they recognize?
I don't know if we've talked about any particular instances, but one of the early conversations with the sophists was, is justice something that exists in nature? Is there objective absolute justice? Is there natural justice? Or is justice just a convention? And so the sophists were arguing that justice is just a convention. Socrates argues, no, justice exists by nature. Well, he points out that there is a problem with saying that, so it must exist by nature. So Socrates is the one coming forth saying, no, these things exist independent of us, and using Greek terminology, then justice is a natural ordering. It's not a convention. It doesn't just exist because man put it there. So Socrates introduces that notion, but natural laws with the Greeks have kind of always existed even in their mythology, because in their mythology there's always the notion that they have called necessity. That's what they call it, and necessity is this ambiguous notion that exists even above the gods, and everything that happens according to necessity. And so necessity ensures that justice in the end plays out. And so while they didn't believe in strict determinism, you can still choose how to live your life. Necessity, to some effect, forms how your life goes overall to make sure in the end justice is done. Some analogy might be, your employer gives you a job, so they're forcing you to do that job, but how you do that job is completely your choice. So you have free will, you can do what you want in this world, but necessity still makes sure that the overall arching outline of your life tends towards justice, and not just for you, for the gods as well. So no one gets away from necessity. And so early on with these thinkers, they had very closely tied up with how the universe evolves, a notion of justice, keeping things balanced, keeping things in harmony. And so it was somewhat confused what they were talking about. So it's like natural law, the way we think about natural law for like natural human law was very much mixed up with natural laws, the way we think about scientific laws early on.
Yeah.
And that distinction is slowly being made with time. But as far as the foundations for how we think about natural law, that is going to happen with Aristotle's Ethics. So once again, he starts off a whole field. Anyways, how did this world come into existence? Okay, we have the Demiurge. We talked about that. The argument for the Demiurge is one of the earliest known arguments from design. Since the world is so ordered, there must have been an orderer. Common form of this argument is the Watchmaker Argument. If you were walking down a beach and you saw a watch, would you think that just happened to come around like that, or would you assume there must have been some watchmaker who produced that watch? And so you're seeing someone's craft. If there's such a high amount of order in something, if it looks like it was designed to function a particular way, you tend to conclude that there was a designer. More sophisticated forms of this argument in modern days there's a bunch of constants in our universe that are the way that they are, and that govern our universe. And if you were to even slightly tweak one of these constants by a minuscule amount and run a simulation for a universe, the whole universe falls apart. So we can play with these constants, tweak them, and do computer simulations to see how universe would evolve if we slightly tweak these things. And if you barely tweak these things, it completely falls apart. And to give you a sense of how sensitive it is, imagine I had, you know those scales where you have to perfectly slide the weights to get it just right so it's perfectly balanced? All right, imagine that we were trying to adjust one of these scales and I had it perfectly balanced on this iron bar that went across the length of the observable universe. And it's steady and it's balanced and everything's fine. Now imagine I shift it by the width of a hair and the whole universe falls apart. That's how delicate these numbers are. If you change them by even this minuscule, impossible to imagine just how minuscule we're talking about, amount, the whole universe falls apart. So some people use that as an argument. There must have been a designer for this universe. It's so fickle. If you barely tweak anything, if this was all just random, how did we get something so perfect? The analogy they often make to help it appeal to your intuition is, imagine a tornado went through a trailer park and assembled a functional jumbo jet. That's what it's like, if it's supposed to be just random. So arguments from creation, or arguments from design, I mean, one of the earliest forms of the argument. We don't need to go through the details of it because we'll get to more sophisticated ones assuming we continue with this class long enough. Who knows? We're down to 4 people. We'll see. But, so, he gives an argument from design for the Demiurge. Okay, now we need to understand evil in his universe. Because we might be tempted to think, oh, well, the same way that there's good, and maybe there's a form of the good, if there's evil, there must also be a form of the evil, which he doesn't like. So how do we explain evil in this universe? He is going to explain evil as a lack of good. So, what about evil in the universe? The forms are good, and so something is good to the extent that it mirrors its form. Evil is the lack of good in something. So the best analogy I can think of to help this appeal to your intuition is the way that we think about light. Light is a physical thing, it's photons. Light exists. I can hold a handful of light. That makes sense. What's darkness?
Yeah.
Show me the physical thing that's darkness. Right, there isn't a physical darkness particle. There isn't anything that's darkness. Darkness just means there isn't light. That's what darkness is. Darkness is just a lack of light. So in similar way, that's the way that he talks about evil. There isn't such a thing as evil out there. Evil is the lack of the good. You are evil to the extent that you fail to imitate the form of madness. You are good to the extent that you do imitate the form of madness. And so they would say madness incorporates things like courage, temperance, justice, wisdom. To the extent that you cultivate these virtues, you become more manly. Virtue, if you look at the etymology of the word, early on means manliness in a man. So you extend these things, you become more good because you become more real, because you are closer exhibiting reality. And the further away you go from those virtues, the more vicious you become, vice as opposed to virtue. So vicious, I don't know how you think about vicious. Vicious means actions that aren't virtues. The more cowardly you become, the more unjust you become, etc.
So are these more the natural laws you're talking about? The human conditions?
That would be a natural law, yes. So anyways, so the extent to which you adhere to your essence, the extent to which you adhere to your form, the more real you become and the better you become, the more good you become. The good is real and the real is good. And the less real you become, the more fake you become, the more of an imitation you become, the more evil you become. So, goodness and reality very closely tied together, and evilness is approaching nothingness. So nothing eviler than the void, I guess.
So the less that this resembles chairness, the more evil it becomes.
Right, so you can also talk about whether it's a good chair or a bad chair. And you rank order chairs with reference to some form of chairness. And there's good chairs and bad chairs, and some are better chairs than other chairs. And so the extent to which a chair fulfills its essence, its purpose, we call it a good chair. And to the extent that it fails to do that, we call it a bad chair.
Can't that change?
It's lacking the formness of chair.
can't a good chair to someone be a lot more soft and a bad chair to someone be softer? So if somebody prefers chairs to be a lot harder, that becomes a good chair. Whereas somebody else doesn't like hard chairs, that becomes an evil chair.
No. Because your opinion and reality, all you can do is have better taste or worse taste. That's all you can do. You can hope to align your taste in chairs with what is actual chairness. It's the same way that it comes to teaching you mathematics. What if it makes sense to someone that 2 + 2 is 5? And good for them. Doesn't make it so. Learn the truth. I'm sorry you prefer the world where 2 + 2 is 5. I'm sorry that makes your life easier, more convenient, you're more comfortable with that. It doesn't change the fact that 2 + 2 is 4, always has been, always will be.
But if everybody has the sense of chairness ingrained within them, that they know would be a chairness, and if they saw something that resembles it, they would know it's chairness, right?
No, you have to recollect that chairness. You have to put effort forward to recollect that chairness. You don't instantly recollect things. There's a process you have to go through. We'll go through that in his epistemology about how you recollect something, and it's a process that you physically have to go through. It's the same process that we call learning. You would think everyone knows what numbers are, and so everyone should just know arithmetic. No, people can still be wrong about it, even though they could know it if they put forth the effort. So there's no difference in understanding a good chair from a bad chair than between a good argument and a bad argument. And just because you were deceived into accepting a bad argument doesn't suddenly make it right. If you were deceived into thinking a bad chair is a good chair, doesn't make it a good chair. So, yeah, he'd say you can have good taste and you can have bad taste. And if you like bad chairs, you have bad taste in chairs. And if you like chairs that are closer to the form, then you have good taste in chairs. And you say the same thing about like artwork. Some people like ugly artwork. Some people like beautiful artwork. Say you have bad taste in art. That's less beautiful. This is more beautiful. Your opinion about it doesn't mean anything. It is what it is. And all you can hope to do is align your opinion with reality. Make sense? I'm trying to think about the particular one that they talk about in the Republic. That's why I'm sure this conversation's had in the Republic. That's why I'm saying I'm trying to remember exactly what they talk about there. I mean, they make much to do about music, in particular, good music and bad music. And good music brings out the virtues of a man. Bad music brings out the vices of a man. So there's better music and worse music.
Yeah.
Similar thing, you might think, well, I prefer this music. You have bad preferences, is what you would say.
Don't they talk about Socrates? Doesn't Socrates mention how ugly he is? Or something like that?
Socrates mentions that he's an unattractive man.
I was just wondering if that's where the conversation arose.
No, there is in the Symposium, they say that the reason that you find something beautiful is to the extent that it mirrors beauty. So they have believed in objective and absolute beauty, and the extent to which something mimics that form is to the extent to which it is beautiful. And so that's why you're attracted to certain things, is because it mirrors that beauty. So Socrates says, the philosopher, he loves someone because it points him towards what beauty is. He talks about lesser people who get caught up in the particulars. They fall in love with just the object. So he loves an object for directing him towards beauty, not the object in and of itself, because it still has flaws. But I'm sure we'll get to that when we talk about aesthetics. I don't know, because I don't have that written yet. Did we finish this? We finished this. Any questions on this anymore? Good? Okay. So that was what was in the crucial stuff in the Timaeus. It's actually a pretty big dialogue, and there's a lot in there. Anyways, so the world of forms isn't a random collection of universals. All the forms are logically connected to each other into one integrated system. Now I'm trying to give you an outline of the picture of what just the world of forms looks like. So it's not like just because I have a universal for some types of objects and another universal and they're just disconnected, we have a bunch of universals. He says these universals are also logically connected with each other in some system. They're all systematically connected together. So if I prove that the sum of the angles in a triangle is 180 degrees, that's a relationship I discovered that exists in the world of forms between triangularity and 180 degree-ness. Those two universals are related by this theorem. So theorems, when we discover logical connections between theorems, are discovering actual structure to the world of forms. So the world of forms embeds the logical connections that we discover here on Earth. When you discover logical connections between things, relationships between things, properties that things have, you are discovering structure that actually exists in the world of forms. So in math, we often have a couple propositions, and we set those propositions together imply some other proposition. That's discovering structure that actually exists in the world of forms. Thou canst not know what is not. If you can know it, it somehow exists. And since the way that we come to know things is by logicking through all these connections, this implies this, those logical connections are talking about actual structure that exists. I can't stress that enough. Logical implication and a structure existing in the world of forms, same thing. Okay. So the world of forms isn't a random collection of universals. All the forms are logically connected to each other into one integrated system. All natural laws and mathematical theorems are expressions of how these forms are related to each other. When we say all men are mortal, we are expressing a relationship between the manness, is what I mean that, the manness and mortality universals. When we say that the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, we are expressing a relationship between triangularity and 180 degree-ness. So anything we discover, it's structures that actually exist in the world of forms. All knowledge is about the forms and how they are related to each other. The goal of knowledge is to understand the overall structure of the world of forms. Good there? 9 o'clock, let me see how much we have. Not too much more. I think we can finish this. Okay. So, note that every field of knowledge starts with basic premises. The field then works to deduce the logical implications of the given set of premises. So, we're in mathematics. If you're in geometry, you start with postulates of geometry, you work out the logical implications. He didn't quite have that, but similar thinking. In the world of physics, if we were doing two-dimensional kinematics on the surface of the Earth, we'd start with the assumption that objects accelerate downwards at 9.81 meters per second squared. We were talking about ethics, we might start with the assumption that needs are universal human desires, something like that. Some premises, some assumptions that we start with in all these different fields, and then we determine their logical implications. These basic premises assume some relationship between the forms and then work to determine what other structure must exist in the world of forms. So we're like trying to jump in at one place in the world of forms. So this world of forms is some big web of logical connections. We take our premises, jumping in at some point in the world of forms, and then we start determining the connections from there. And we discover upwards from there. But we're completely ignorant of what's down here or how to prove those premises. We never actually prove these premises. So we never know how these are connected into the world of forms. We just know it from here on out. Unless we can validate these basic premises, all our knowledge remains hypothetical. What if these don't even exist in the world of forms? What if we start with bad premises? All we know that is, if our premises are true, then our conclusions must be true. We do not know that the premises themselves are true, and therefore we do not know that they actually exist in the world of forms. Once we know that they're true, once we actually have knowledge of them, then they for sure exist in the world of forms. We need some foundation, some self-intelligible form from which we can derive all our axioms, or postulates, I don't know what word I was using before. Basic premises, axioms, postulates, all the same thing here. Derive all our axioms and thereby validate all our knowledge and achieve a unity in all our knowledge. So if I have, draw these out one more time again. So if I have, these are my axioms for mathematics, these are my axioms for physics, these are my axioms for ethics. If I could somehow work my way down to some basic one from which I can start working, and that gives me this, and this gives me these three, and etc. If I could find some basic foundation to start with from which I could derive all these things, not only do I prove every body of knowledge, but I combine it into one completely integrated system. One system of knowledge, one body of knowledge altogether. So what seems like different fields are actually all tied together by this amazing first self-intelligible premise. Self-intelligible meaning once you come into contact with it, you just understand it. Self-intelligible doesn't need to be proven. Self-evident truth is later terminology that's used a lot. It's self-evident, self-intelligible. Once you come across it, you just know it. There's no disputing it. Good with what we're saying so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So we need some foundation. I already said that. I don't know if I finished this. From which we can derive all our axioms and thereby validate all our knowledge and achieve a unity in all our knowledge. So mathematics, physics, and ethics would all be related, all tied together into one body of knowledge. Once again, looking for the one and the many, what is the nature of the one supreme form from which all other forms can ultimately be derived? Whatever it is, it needs to be the explanation of everything. Everything has to come from this one form. Now, Plato is a universal teleologist, one who believes that the entire universe serves some purpose. So everything in the universe is targeted at some purpose, as opposed to a mechanistic or a material mechanist, chemicals in motion the way that the atomists were. So he would say that the atomist, the mechanist, can only describe how things happen, not why. If you want to know why something happens, you need to understand the purpose it was created for. So he thinks you have to have a teleological view. You have to think about it in terms of purposes to know why something exists. Why did that man make that chair that way? For the purpose of a chair. He did it for some purpose. It was targeted at some end. So people who have this view that we're just chemicals and motions, Plato says, all they can do is describe how things are happening. They can't tell you why things are happening. So if you want to know why, if you want an explanation, and not just how, a description, then it must be in terms of some purpose. You have to know the purpose of things if you're going to know why. Since every action aims at some good, anytime you take some action, it's targeted at achieving some good. Whether you succeed or fail is irrelevant. The point is it's targeted at a good. Since every action aims at some good, then the ultimate form must be the form of the good, the thing which everything is ultimately aimed at. This form right here he's going to call the form of the good. And what are the functions of the good, the form of the good? The good is the purpose of all existence, and so it is the source of all existence. Nothing happens void of purpose. So since everything happens for a purpose, everything happens for some good, abstract from all those goods to the form of the good, and that's what everything's targeted at, right? You're after a particular good, he's after a particular good, I'm after a particular good. Take the form of the good now, goodness, take the form of the good, and that is what we're all targeted at. So since nothing happens void of purpose, then, well, read it from here again. The good is the purpose of all existence, and so is the source of all existence. Nothing happens void of purpose. And the source of all existence and the source of all knowledge are going to be one and the same thing. Because knowledge and the structure of reality are one and the same. The more knowledge you have, the more you're experiencing reality. Reality and knowledge are one and the same thing. They're these forms, the connections of these forms. So since the good is also the fundamental axiom, it is fundamentally the source of all knowledge. It's what makes anything understandable. That's why I stress so much the picture, understanding that the forms and their logical connections is giving, when you know something, when you know a theorem, that's a logical connection between the forms. It's something about the structure of reality. Is this making sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe, well, I guess we'll come back and do it next time, but we'll just finish up these two slides and then review them. So Plato relates the form of the good to the sun. The sun both enables existence on the earth as well as knowledge of the earth. So you remember the allegory of the cave. We'll come across that again next week. One of the things he makes an analogy between is how the sun acts kind of like the form of the good. It's the best analogy he can think of. So not only is, if you think about the physical, just an analogy, think about the physical earth existing as the void, then the sun enables us and all life to exist on the earth. It's fundamentally responsible for our existence here. Without the sun, we don't exist here. So it's responsible in that sense. So it's responsible for actual existence. Now the relationship, the analogy he always uses is the same way that we see with our mind. The analogy he uses is actually seeing with our eye. The sun is also responsible for us seeing anything in the physical reality that we see. So in that way, the sun is responsible for all knowledge that we have, everything that we see, and it's also responsible for all the existence on the earth, everything in existence. So the sun's responsible for all existence on the earth, and the sun's responsible for all knowledge of existence on the earth. In like way, the form is responsible for all of existence. The form of the good is responsible for all of existence, and it's responsible for all knowledge of existence. It comes back to the form of the good. But what exactly is this good now? So, okay, that's all great. What exactly is this form of the good? Give it to me, Plato, so I can understand this self-intelligible goodness and I can derive all the truths of existence from it. What exactly is it? Well, unfortunately, Plato, at the very least, thought that it could not be explained in writing. So, in one of his letters, when someone's asking about it, he says, this is something that we need to be talking about. I can't just write it to you. The only way to make it make sense to a particular, I guess, is to get into in-depth, deep conversation with them and slowly bring them to it somehow. And he possibly thought that it was altogether ineffable, and that it requires a sort of achieved intuition such that once attained is self-intelligible. So a common expression that we use that helps capture this notion is, to those that know, no explanation is necessary. To those that don't, no explanation is possible.
You either get it or you don't.
Yep. Once you get it, okay, you get it, and there's no reason for me to try to explain to you. If you don't get it yet, sorry, there's no way for me to explain it to you. You just got to have this insight. It's just the sudden revelation that just occurs to you, and now you get it. Oh, yes, the form of the good. And he thought that it was so self-intelligible that once you got it, there was no mistaking it. You for sure got it. It's like if I told you, there's a massive canyon that way. Once you reach it, you'll know. And you come across a Grand Canyon, you know you've reached that massive canyon. You can't miss it. So once you experience it, you know you've experienced it. You now know the form of the good. And now you can understand everything. And while you see that it's a bit absurd, you see the idealism that he was aiming for and how he was trying to tie everything together. It's pretty amazing what he tried to do. So, summary of Plato's metaphysics. There are two worlds, the worlds of the imperfect, physical, changing particulars, and the world of perfect, non-physical, or abstract, static universals. This world and the world of forms. The world of forms is projected into the void, creating this physical world. The good is the fundamental form, the reason for everything, and the source of our ability to comprehend anything. And note how closely tied together the good and the true are now. Remember that Socrates was on the search for the good, the true, and the beautiful. And Plato is determined to tie all these things together. And so now you see how closely he's tied the good and the true together. The good is a source of the true. Once you comprehend the good, the true is just logical implications. So he's now got those tied together. So that covers his metaphysics, and I guess we'll do his epistemology next week. Any questions on that? I know that was kind of a lot right at the end. I kind of rushed, so we didn't go too long. Good?
Yep.
And then feel free to ponder it, think about it, come back with any questions or metaphysical questions next time, and we can start class answering any of those.